research. We compared all kinds of fuels and all kinds of drivetrains, and we determined that propane, CNG, they nibbled at the edges. They were never a full solution. Electric school buses were evaluated. We felt the technology theoretically made sense, but it was still in the early stages of being commercialized. And the biggest barrier to electric school buses that still exists today is the high purchase price. And when you look at school budgets, they are very rigid and not very flexible, and any chance to put money towards education programs is their priority versus transportation. So asking them to come up with, 3.5 times the budget that they had for buses is a burden. It's really a hard barrier. But the advantages of the school buses are the kids have a healthier ride to school. They're not breathing the emissions that come back in through the windows from the tailpipe. They also see savings in maintenance. They see savings in fueling costs, and these buses are just as capable as any other bus, with the exception of interstate travel or longer distances that require rapid charging, because the rapid charging stations can't really fit the size of the bus. So that committee received a grant from the Massachusetts Clean Cities Coalition to purchase an electric school bus in a pilot done in 2016. That pilot bus is still operating today and doing great. It had, we were the first in the nation to take this purpose-built electric school bus and put it into use. And Amherst and Cambridge were also in that pilot, which followed us. And they also put those into use. And we kind of, I'll put it this way. My town manager looked at me and he said, Brian, I don't mind being the leading edge, but I don't want to be the bleeding edge. And I said, well, sorry, you're the bleeding edge this time. And that was the expectations we had. And that was kind of the experience we had for the first year or so. So if you look at our report, it details all of our things very honestly. The good thing is that Lion took the bus back and reworked it about a year and a half ago, and it has had almost no issues. And we had gone out for our second bus using Volkswagen funding, and we originally had planned to do a Bluebird bus, and after an RFP, we ended up going with Lion again. So if people read the first report and realize that we're going with Lion again, it really says, how far they've come along. So with that, that's kind of me right now. I'm a member of the Concord Light Board. I'm not speaking on their behalf, but I'm currently a board member at the utility. So that is generally my background. And I can answer a lot of questions about buses just simply because I've been near those kinds of projects in the past. I don't claim to be an expert, but a lot of people think I am. So I can't change what other people say. But I do know a fair amount, and I am always willing to share my time to explain what I know, to help other people in these kinds of projects, because a diesel bus puts out a lot of fumes and exhaust, and these electric buses, not only can they make it a healthier ride to schools, but it can also be a revenue stream for schools, which is a part of the conversation that's often lost. So with that, I entertain questions. I'm better with a Q&A than I am with a presentation. I also have some presentations I could show if you want some slides to reference.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Susan.
You talked about the Mass Clean Cities Coalition giving you a grant for your initial electric school bus. Are they still giving grants?
No. So it was Reggie funds, the regional greenhouse gas. So there's the electric utilities in the Northeast are part of Reggie, and they were able to put $1.8 million aside to Massachusetts to do this pilot. But that money has been spent and is unfortunately long gone. And that is the biggest barrier right now, is that first purchase price. Everything else we've pretty much got solved. The technology, the other things. It's just we got to get the battery modules to come down in price.
And so are there any other alternative sources of grant funds?
Many. So there is.
Brian, could I just jump in here? This will attach to Susan's questions. Maybe you could connect it a little bit with HET and how they're funding it and how you're funding it, and the difference between seeking all that kinds of funding that you need to go for.
Yes, so that's a good point. Concord is uniquely positioned as a town. We have our own electric utility, Concord Light, that serves just our town. It doesn't serve multiple towns. We have a school district which still owns and operates its own fleet. And so essentially all players are underneath the town manager, which means that when we go to deploy a bus and we look into things like vehicle to grid for revenue streams and so forth, we just talk about town budget. We don't have to talk about lawyers and contracts and negotiate agreements. Eversource, National Grid, they are investor-owned utilities. They are regulated by the state. They do what they're regulated to do, no more, no less. And I've heard, I don't know if she's a president or a vice president at National Grid, talk that way about what they do. So what really is needed is state level action to create a year-over-year program that communities and school committees can follow and plan around. When you asked about what is the current funding opportunities, the Volkswagen Settlement Awards, so the pilot was the first 3 buses. The Volkswagen Settlement, there were 4 school buses in the first round, 1 to Concord, 2 to Martha's Vineyard, and 1 to another town. I can't quite remember.
Cambridge, I think.
Was it Cambridge? I think Cambridge was in the pilot. This is the Volkswagen funding, which I think.
I'm sorry.
Was it Amherst?
No, Amherst was in the first. Oh, it was Beverly. Beverly was the other one. And then there was the Mass CEC funding through the Act Now program. And that has 3 school buses, 1 in Arlington, a 2nd in Beverly, and I don't remember the 3rd. But it is another new community that wasn't listed prior. But those are the 10 electric school buses that have been funded in the state. Compare this to some other states like Virginia. Virginia has partnered with Dominion Energy. Dominion Energy deployed 50 buses in the first year and will deploy a few thousand before 2030. And they hope to have all buses in the school districts electrified. And the reason that the state was able to partner with the utility is the utility sees the value of operating that bus while it's idle. And that's the vehicle to grid component. It's essentially battery storage that also moves kids around. And those stationary batteries can reduce the expenses the utility sees quite significantly. In California, there's Stockton, California School District has 40 buses in their own fleet that are full electric. But this all comes down to funding. In Virginia, they funded it by partnering with the utility. In California, they fund it through their cap and trade system. Massachusetts needs some kind of funding source, whether it's TCI or other means in which to fund school districts the capital needed to get over that barrier of buying a $350,000 bus instead of a $100,000 diesel bus. I mean, this is a significant financial barrier, but the reward for getting over that barrier is again the lower maintenance, the lower operating costs or fueling costs, but then the value that partnering with the utility can bring. And this is going to go back to Susan's comment about Highland versus what Concord is doing. So Concord is working with our own utility so that we can see the value no matter where it comes from with this bus, whether it's lowering our electric rates or through other means. In places where, like Beverly has an investor-owned utility. I forget if it's Eversource or National Grid, but they have an agreement with that, or Highland has an agreement with the utility to get value for operating that battery while it's idle, reducing the utility's expenses, and they pass some of that along to Highland. That allows Highland to then offer Beverly a price of operating an electric school bus at the cost that it would be to do a diesel. So that's kind of the business model that they're using. And it is, you know, they're trying to qualify as many of them for the incentives as possible. And then they're trying to work with partners like the utility to find revenue streams in order to keep that price of going electric for a school district equivalent to that of a diesel. And that's, like I said, this is the purchase price difference is about $200,000 to $250,000. That's the delta that they're trying to cover with these agreements and with those incentives. So it's something that is great to see because many more communities have utilities that are investor owned versus municipally owned, which is what Concord has. And I'm throwing a lot of stuff at you, so please feel free to ask questions, ask me to repeat things or clarify things. Oh, I think you're muted.
Go ahead, Marcia.
Is the way that the company that, like HET, is able to continue to operate successfully, that they offload the stored energy at a time when the cost of it, the value of it is high, and then they charge it in the middle of the night when the cost of electricity is low, so they're gaining the benefit of the higher cost?
Yes, so that's exactly what they're doing. So I'm gonna share my screen for a second because I explained this from the standpoint of Concord in an article. I was requesting funding, and let me. So can everyone see that?
Yes.
All right, let me see if I do that. Does that help? So this is if you can see my mouse, this is the construction of our bus depot happening in 2017. And you can see from the drone picture, the solar array that our utility owns that's behind it. So Concord sees value in operating our buses that are parked here by not only soaking up the extra Sunday solar saturation. So we'll deplete the battery down to 20%. And then on a Sunday morning in the spring, when we have a solar saturation issue on our distribution system, we can absorb that excess production into the buses and then put that extra production into the evening peak when our distribution sees a higher load. This lowers our RNS charges, which are our cost of moving electricity to Concord from generators far flung throughout New England. So what I've shown here is how the bus kind of manages the state of charge. You can see here at 1 in the morning, the state of charge is quite low, and then it charges up, and then you see this orange line. This is our general load at our substation. So you can see when there's low demand in the middle of the night for electricity, that's when we charge these buses. And then this depletion here is when the bus goes out in the morning for 3 to 4 hours to drive students to school with the different, the elementary, the middle school, and the high school. And then we here you can see that it's back at the depot. That's what the green is. And then we didn't do any charge there, but we let it continue to deplete when we ran that bus for everybody going home from school. But that leaves us at 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon that the bus is back and plugged in. So we give it a little bit of a charge, and then we discharge the full battery down to 20% to reduce the costs that the utility incurs for that evening peak of demand for electricity. And then we recharge it the next day and go through the same cycle. Here is the cost to Concord for the transmission of energy from these far-flung generators to our town. And this occurred it's like a demand charge each month for our utility. So 1 hour each month, this fee is incurred. And if you take those 12 hours each year, it adds up to about $4 million a year that our small utility pays to the ISO to move our electricity. And you can see that the per kilowatt hour cost of that fee continues to go up. And it continues to go up because where the energy is generated and where it's consumed is becoming further and further distances on our grid. And thus we have to pay more to support and maintain those transmission lines. So here's an example of what the battery can do on that. This is I'm pointing with my hand, that doesn't work. So here is a spring day on a Sunday when our town's demand for electricity is super low and our production of solar energy is high. You can see this kind of duck shape here. That is our duck curve on our distribution system, where we have so much solar being produced that we have a threat of getting down to zero. And that is not good for the substation. It's not designed for that. So we can charge our buses for the Monday run during the low point there, allowing us to put more solar in town and more renewables onto our distribution system. And then the opposite scenario is when consumer demand for electricity is very high. This happens on a summer day, and it's between June and September. There's a special fee, which is a capacity fee that is paid. And this fee is quite large. And you can see here's our average load, but our peak loads go up quite significantly for our town. And we pay per kilowatt hour for that. This is the market that we're paying into. Currently, it is at a minimum price, which is, you can see in this price chart over time that this price has dropped again. So we're paying about $4 million or $3 million this year for capacity. But in years past, instead of paying about $3 per kilowatt hour, we were paying 15. And when you take 15 times our load, I've seen this expense almost get to $10 million, which really raises rates for consumers. In fact, our utility saw this coming, and so they started raising rates early and into a fund that was rate stabilization, and then depleted that rate stabilization fund on the other side of the curve over, I think, a 5-year period. So these fees are something that vehicle to grid technology and these school buses can generate savings, and that savings can be passed along directly to the schools in Concord's case, or can be passed along through Highland Electric in the form of not paying that barrier of the high purchase price. And again, I'm throwing a lot of stuff at you, and I see a hand raised. So I'd love to take questions.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there's any issues with the warranty on the battery, because when you discharge it into the grid, that's not its intended use.
It is its intended use. They're being designed to do vehicle to grid. And you are correct. The warranty has changed from that of a standard diesel. So a standard diesel engine has a warranty of miles driven. The warranty written for these buses is about duty cycles on the battery. So how many times has the battery been charged and discharged? And that's how they scale their warranties.
And it doesn't matter whether the discharge is into the grid or into the vehicle's system.
Exactly.
Okay.
Brian, can you maybe return to how communities like those on Cape Ann who do not have their own electricity system going for them and cannot benefit as directly, what do we do? How do we finance these things? We've heard from HET, it sounds almost too good to be true. Should we look at it that way, or are there other problems that we can't see?
I'm not sure if I understand that question. So I think that right now, if I'm talking to, I talked to Arlington recently about their bus, and I said, going with a Highland Electric is a good way to finance things. It's a good way to have the resources for the deployment to go smoothly. They've done this in Beverly. They've done this, I've shared with them a lot of my knowledge. They have worked with the design companies for the building of the infrastructure. They cover off on a lot of things that at the first point of thinking about getting an electric school bus, people aren't thinking of. Concord has learned those things through doing. We've had, 4 years or 5 years of going through the pilot and doing these things. We also have our own utility to lean on, and it's been of value. So I would suggest that communities that have an investor-owned utility work with Highland, especially on their first, because it will go as smoothly as Beverly has. And I don't know all the details about Beverly, but I'm sure they were faced with some challenges that they had to work out, and they had someone to lean on that knew something about the industry. So there was good value there. If it's in municipally owned utility, they have more of a choice. I wouldn't say, go it alone and don't use Highland. I would say compare what you could do with either of those. Go ahead.
I have a question. When HET gave their talk at the last informational meeting, they said that we could either hook up to the grid or we could hook up to some other source if we wanted to. I don't know if you know anything about that. Like we don't have our own light plant, but is there any way we could have our own sources or something here on Cape Ann? Or I don't know if you know about that. Energy sources.
Yeah, I don't know about that. Do you have a large, I think Susan, you'd said something about Gloucester was thinking about this.
Well, Gloucester has a lot of municipal rooftops that personally I would like to fill. And we also have, if we go with electric buses, it seems prudent to have a huge electrical solar panel in terms of on our parking lots at the schools. I mean, there are lots of ways that we can put in solar to feed the electricity to make us more green, so we don't have to go into the grid as much as we do now.
I always support putting in solar, especially when it's dual use, where it's on top of a building or on top of a parking lot. It really doesn't matter. I think you know, getting electricity from the grid, you'll be under the commercial rates, and it would probably be financially advantageous to work with the commercial, the grid as your source of charging. I heard someone else.
Can I jump in for a second? Yeah. This is Bruce, and I'm sorry for joining late. I've been dealing with 3 different calls at once, so I apologize. But sure. The conversation that we had at that last presentation was about trying to ensure that the buses were powered by as many renewable sources as possible, as opposed to risking the fact that carbon emitting sources might be used.
Okay.
And so the discussion was had about, if we entered into an agreement, would that subject us to the monopoly of one particular electric supplier, i.e. the grid? And the further discussion was about whether or not we could develop some of our own renewable sources, i.e. Solar or even wind, because Gloucester has been pioneering in wind energy generation, couple that with storage, and then be able to feed the recharge of the buses all or in part.
Yes, it sounds a lot like what Martha's Vineyard is doing with their transit authority. So they have a solar array that is charging a battery, and they're charging their transit buses that way. You could also look at municipal aggregation. There's for every megawatt hour of electricity that's generated onto the grid, it's all a certification is created. And municipal aggregation works where they take the renewable certificates and aggregate them to ensure that you own the claim to the positive environmental attributes of renewable generation. And that's what municipal aggregation is. So you could set up an energy supply contract to get municipal aggregation for the town of Gloucester, and many other towns have done that.
Well, we have municipal aggregation, but I'm not clear how that would, how that fits with the electric bus.
Sure.
Tell me the connection a little bit more clearly, please.
Yeah, it's selection of fuel source. The way that the electric grid works is every electric generator generates electricity. The electrons flow onto a backbone of the grid, and then those go down to distribution networks, and then those goes to homes and businesses for the demand side. The way that solar panels and wind and hydro are accounted for in the renewable energy standards portfolio is through these RECs and through the AnyPool GIS system. That system tracks what generators have, are generating from different fuels, and then certifies each megawatt hour that they generate, and those certificates can be traded. And utilities use these certificates to comply with the state's RPS program, the Renewable Standards Program. Our utility, Concord Light, is not part of the RPS, as all municipal light plants are not part of it. But we, in 2017, chose to go out and buy and retire these RECs, or renewable energy certificates, so that we could hold the claim that we're over 50% renewable energy, with a target of 2030 being 100% non-emitting electricity. And so it's a real disconnect for most sustainability advocates when they say, well, I've got solar panels on my house has renewable electricity powering it. The answer is if you sell your SRECs, then the utility owns those claims of the positive environmental attributes that solar arrays produce. And so that's how municipal aggregation works, is they aggregate these renewable energy certificates. They take them away from the investor-owned utilities to comply with the renewable energy, the RPS, and that increases the number of renewables on the New England grid. That's how you get more demand and more renewable energy installed in New England.
Didn't HEP say that they were retaining the certificates?
I don't know what they say because I wasn't at that meeting and I haven't seen a recording of it. But if they are buying the renewable energy certificates and retiring those certificates with the NE-Pool GIS system, and it doesn't get sold to investor-owned utility, then they are adding renewables for the fuel, the electricity that goes into their bus. They're doing the aggregate. If they said that statement, they're doing the aggregation for you.
Brian, could you comment on whether limits to net metering in municipalities would have any effect on this? For instance, if Gloucester added a big solar field somewhere as a source of electricity for a renewable, for an electric bus fleet, would we be limited by the state's net metering caps or the grid's net metering caps in any way from being able to go fully self-supported on the electric buses?
I have theories, but I honestly don't know that level of detail. I generally work in the municipal light plant kind of sphere instead of the investor-owned utility sphere. If you want to send me an email, I have a Google list of people that could answer that question promptly.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brian.
What do you do on the longer trips with the buses, like to sports events when the kids are traveling farther? Yeah,
so currently we're not planning to use it for sporting events. What has to happen for that to work is more level 3 charging in New England, in the New England area. That it can fit a vehicle the size of a school bus for that to happen. So the range on these buses is about 120 miles to 155 miles per charge. So if you have a sporting event, on Cape Ann, they could easily go around Cape Ann. But if you have one in upstate Maine or out in Vermont, you probably still take a diesel bus today.
So do you have regular diesel buses as a part of your fleet still? Yes. For that purpose?
Yeah, so we have a goal of an 80-20 fleet. And I like to make goals that you can accomplish today and make them for dates in the future. 100% sounds great, but usually conversations focus on the 2% that's the hardest to solve rather than the 80% that's the easiest. And so setting a target of an 80-20 fleet, 80% electric, 20% diesel or hybrid, that goal can change when we're at 80% and we find that technology has advanced, but that's currently Concord's goal.
Do you think that hydrogen will fuel that in the future?
So my father actually worked in carbon composites, and he actually worked on Canada's buses with their hydrogen. He made the fuel cell stacks. Hydrogen is always 20 to 30 years away, and it always remains 20 to 30 years away. Hydrogen has a role, whether it's like aircraft, it may have a role. In large, heavy vehicles like semi-trucks, it has a role. Anywhere where you need that real fuel density and vast amounts of fuel, that's a good place for it. I've talked to some of these manufacturers that make the electric school buses and propose the idea of a hydrogen range extender. But right now that's so theoretical. If we get to a point where we have, I mean, these buses have 200 kilowatt hour battery packs. If we want to take the range from 120 miles to 600 miles for a school bus, you just simply can't pack enough lithium ion or lithium phosphate onto that vehicle to make it go that far. The weight just gets crazy high. So hydrogen would be the way to get that kind of range. It also offers an ability, because a hydrogen fuel cell generates electric current, but it also generates a lot of waste heat. And that waste heat could be used to heat the cabin, because that's where you get a lot of range losses if you use resistance electricity to heat the cabin. If you were to use a fuel cell to generate heat, use that heat to circulate through the cabin, that could be an advantage. But as it stands today, or as my knowledge of it stands today, you can't drive a hydrogen vehicle through a tunnel in Boston because it's not approved. So hydrogen is going to have a role in the future. Quebec, Hydro-Quebec is a great source because they have ample electrical generation to make the electrolysis happen, and then transport that hydrogen down to New England from Quebec. But most of the hydrogen today is refined gas, and that's quite polluting. So hydrogen isn't today. Hydrogen is at least a decade.
Thank you.
Long answers, sorry. I see Tom has got his hand raised. I want to give him the chance.
Two things, just a comment. I think hydrogen buses have been around a long time. They've been running around Japan and California. Maybe they have different rules about what you need to do when you go through a tunnel. I see the big issue as the efficiency. If you have to make your hydrogen from electricity, you lose about 75% on the way in and on the way out. So you only get about half of the energy that you would have had from electricity. So that's just a comment. But speaking
it's actually lower than half. It's about 20%.
Depends what kind of fuel cells you have, I think, and electrolyzers.
Yeah.
Talking about going from electricity to hydrogen back to electricity. I think you can do that round trip in about 50%, but not easy. But my main question is about the heating. You mentioned the resistance heating. When we had somebody's electric bus visiting the CADA, the transit system here, okay, I asked them about what they do for heating, and they said, oh, they have to have a propane heater because in cold weather, it just drains the battery too much. So do you actually use your resistance heating?
So we have on the first bus we received in the pilot, which has a range of 75 miles in pretty ideal conditions, we have a diesel heater. So we use about 25 gallons of diesel a month in those 3 winter months to heat the cabin. That is not necessary anymore because we have in the second bus, it has a 135 or 150 mile range. So the range loss from the cold climate, we have ample battery capacity to conquer that because it's even with like a massive 20% loss of range from cold climate, that's still well over the 76 miles or so that they do in a full day's driving kids back and forth to school.
Okay.
But they should use heat pumps instead of resistance heat to heat the cabin. But that's coming, and that should be in the next year or two.
I thought that was going to be their answer when I asked the question, but then they said propane, which is kind of a sequitur there.
I was surprised with the Thomas, the bus that Beverly has, that they essentially, it's the same diesel bus, just the drivetrain is swapped out. They didn't change the resistance heat. So they have a 20 kilowatt and a 10 kilowatt resistance heater on that bus to heat the cabin. which if they change to a heat pump would be a big range boost for them.
Yeah, it would be. Good.
Lisa.
Well, I want to piggyback on Tom's question, which is, what improvements have you seen in the years? You know, like how much of an improvement have you seen in the technology and what the buses do since you've had them?
They exist. You know, when we first looked for these, we didn't even find, we had found that there were 8 projects that were done in California where they bought a diesel bus, tore out the drivetrain and custom made an electric one. That wasn't going to work for us. Lion, we have the Lion bus that we received is I think it's around their 25th that they've built ever. So when we got the first one, the range of being 75 miles is now, we're talking, you know, over 100 miles. We're up at the 120 to 155. The software that runs the bus or manages this electric drivetrain has come quite a long way. When we first saw it, it was clear that Lion focused a lot on the hardware, and then the software, we kept getting firmware updates for hardware components that they'd better talk to each other. That's all been resolved, and Lion has now made 300 to 500 of these buses, and so they keep the refinement of the vehicles is there. So that's generally what I've seen. I've also seen that a lot of the talk about clean diesel or more efficient diesel is starting to finally subside. There's still a lot of talk about propane, which Roche has a pretty good stake in. But, you know, CNG buses and things like that are going away.
Brian, how can a town like Gloucester or our communities in Cape Ann, how can we best advocate for them, given that school systems and local governments are really strapped for money right now? And like you said, it seems overwhelming task, but it's a needed task. And certainly we need to set an example for our kids, and this would be a good place to start with public transportation, going with school buses. What would be your advocacy go-to approach?
Forge relationships with school committee members, listen to their concerns, talk about the technology. Don't, you know, all or nothing, like 100% of anything is always difficult. So when goal setting, be reasonable, listen and answer their concerns. So if they say, you know, we can't afford an electric school bus because they're so expensive, you can come back and say, okay, well, let me see what kind of, you know, incentives are out there. Whereas the, you know, the Mass EEC ACT program is going to have round 2 pretty soon. Volkswagen settlement's going to have round 2 pretty soon. Let's start to investigate, how do we get these programs to qualify us for these buses to help with that barrier. And then when they say, well, who's going to operate this, you know, or a difficult one is, we outsource our busing, and our third-party school bus operator isn't going to operate this for us. That is what happened with Cambridge. And Cambridge operated a fleet of 1 for a little while and had some difficulties. But then when the contract came up for renewal, they said, well, let's embed this in the contract. And now the third-party operator is operating it for them. I see Dick has his hand up.
Well, I think Susan, and what HET is saying is that they're basically saying they will guarantee no more cost
than a diesel
for a school district. So they're offering school bus transportation as a service. That's the concept. It's like a software service. It's a little bit like leasing. So if you had all the capital in the world, you buy solar panels and you keep the SRECs and you're more sustainable. But if you have to, you don't have all the capital in the world, which our districts don't, then just like a homeowner can lease the panels, they can lease the service of electric buses for no more cost. So I think that's the pitch. And what I've heard from you that's sort of interesting angle here is the public health issue of fumes for kids and the neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. So any data studies on that would be helpful in persuading people, because we know certainly, environmental justice about underserved communities where they're next to highways and they get more asthma. So if we have more asthma threat because of our existing bus fleet and there's no more cost, isn't it a no-brainer? You know?
Yeah. Let me, I'm going to put in the chat a link to this EPA report from my presentation. That should give you some help on that topic. There are many, many reports about the health impacts. I mean, you can, to understand air pollution and the health effects that our kids are experiencing, the COVID lockdown has done a great job of making some visuals. So these are two pictures of the LA skyline, one, during the smog event, one while there was no smog event. But the one on the right is actually, am I sharing? I'm not sharing. You guys can't see what I'm talking about. I apologize. Here we go. Okay. So these two pictures, we have LA in a smog event and LA without a smog event. And all of those particulates that are in the air are going through everyone's lungs. Yeah. And smog is really, some of these NOx gases and things exposed to light, they create these components that are bad for our health. You can see on the right-hand side, these are satellite pictures of NOx emissions. This is coming out of the diesel vehicles. You can see the high concentration as an average for the March month of 2015 through 2019, done by NASA. And here it is showing what the 2020 in March, when we had our first lockdown for COVID, how the massive reduction in these particulates. This is good for human health. This one. And so this is one of my slides about air pollution and why we need to combat these problems. And that source link that I have here is what I put in the chat so you can read for yourself. And we do have to remember that climate change affects us in many ways. These are we have flood events, we have strokes, we have many lung issues, we have ticks and insects that we have plentiful because of the extra heat in our biosphere, or energy in our biosphere. And this is what our military has defined climate change as a threat multiplier. What that means is things that are difficult or bad for us become worse when climate change is involved. You can't fix everything in the world, but you can make those things that go wrong in the world not as bad by fixing climate change. So this was part of my pitch to the town. I try to keep this part of it short for, see this. Oh, this was about the committee that I was on. Trying to see if there's any other valuable slides about this.
Have you sent that particular slide program to us? Have we got that?
I may have. What I can do, if you don't mind just holding on a moment. Services. I know where it is on the web, so I can easily jump to it. I'm going to stop sharing for a second so that I can use the chat function. So that is the link to my the YouTube of my. It relates to my article on school buses last year. So I had made a request for funding for infrastructure at our school bus depot for electric school bus charging, as well as invest $50,000 to cover a funding gap in our school's budget. We hope to, in the next round of Volkswagen funding, apply for 2 school buses. And they cap the amount that you can receive at $500,000 through the program per round. And so with that, the per bus reimbursement is lower, meaning that the schools will put up about $40,000 above what a diesel would cost. And so I went to town meeting and asked for $50,000 to cover that gap. And I got approved. And this slide that I have up now is my goal in Concord. And that is, you know, we've spent between 2008 and 2016, there's been massive efforts of nibbling at the edges about reducing our emissions year over year. This quote came from our consultants that said, you know, a scenario of replacing half of the transportation emissions and half of the residential heating emissions with carbon-free electricity as their energy source would be a 60% reduction in community-wide emissions compared to 2016. So that is hundreds of thousands of tons of carbon reduction in the town of Concord. So that's why I'm working on electric school buses. That's why I'm working on electric vehicles. That's why I'm on the light board to work with utility rates. That's why I'm helping out with heat smart and heat pump adoption, as well as we've written a climate plan for Concord that has a big focus on this. And yeah, this is what we hope to do to reduce our emissions. And you see that last 20% there in 2050. That's going to be the stuff that's the hardest to do. But rather than focus on that today, let's focus on the 80% that we can do today, which is, you know, clean up our electricity is 26% reduction in townwide emissions. Nobody changes a thing they do. If people adopt more electric cars, then every electric car is less gasoline being produced and burned, and more renewables, you know, powering those vehicles. Every heat pump replaces an oil furnace. That's less oil being extracted and put into our air, and more solar, wind, and hydro, and nuclear for Concord that will be powering those homes, which reduces our greenhouse gas emissions. That's off topic from buses, but that's the scope I'm working under.
That's a good scope. Dick, did you have something, Dick?
No, I just saying we're starting a new strategic plan session now, Brian, so we may be calling on you.
Oh, well, now I'm going to put another link in the Zoom, which is to our strategic plan.
That's going to ask you to do. That's great.
And Susan had mentioned that your Gloucester is going to be building a school. So I sent an email to her that has some information about Concord's new middle school building.
We've got some lobbying to do there. I think it's a little late to get it to be total net zero to start, but we succeeded in getting the library to eliminate, to be at least all electric and highly insulated. And so they can always purchase a little more and be net zero. And hopefully we can get the school to do that within the current framework of the design. We just didn't start early enough lobbying to go net zero there. MCAN, as you probably know, is very good on this, and there are multiple schools that are net zero in the state now.
Go ahead.
Just a quickie, Brian, is there a way that we could have access to view your slides? I'd like to spend some more time with them than I could while we were in the midst of your presentation.
Yes, so one of the links in the chat, it'll say Article 30 Healthy School Buses in the URL. Click on that link and it should open up a page. You'll have a YouTube video and 2 links, one to this set of slides that I've been showing, as well as a letter from our Climate Action Advisory Board in support of the article.
Terrific, thank you.
And Candace, he has sent a lot of links, and I will be collating those and sending them out to everybody. I'm going to try to collect them all on one page. There's quite a few of them, and so you can filter through those.
Yeah, and if you, the Climate Action and Resilience Plan, that link is within the sustainability section of Concord's website. And our Kate Hanley, our Director of Sustainability, is awesome. And she has some great resources there. There's our greenhouse gas inventory, our plan to attack that inventory, that's the link directly to our climate action plan. But there's also other reports about business, historic communities, and landscaping for some of the interns we've had, the graduate students that come in and help us identify paths to address those issues.
I would think, Brian, we've had a long history and tussle of being unable to secure sustainability directors in any of the Cape Ann towns. And so they're always underwater and not able to give, the planning staff is always not able to give it the proper attention. So if you have any, or could you manufacture any ROI statistics on the benefit to the town financially of having a high quality coordinator, and what's the payback period? And that to me, we have to make a money argument for this, because it's not going to be, we can't make it on the health of the planet. It's just not going to fly.
Correct. So don't quote me on these numbers, but we have a director of sustainability, and she's brought in probably 2.5 times her salary in the first year in grants. And that's the other thing, I want everybody to have a director of sustainability, but what that creates is a more competitive situation for these grants that pay for those people, which is the sad part. I know Beverly has a grant writing person. I forget her name at the moment, but she's essentially doing a similar job. What you need in a town is someone who can organize the requests the town has with the state, and that's all they do, because it is such a bureaucracy and such a, keeping track of all these things is quite difficult. But having someone like that with sustainability as their focus is even better, which is what Concord has. I was looking up, so what I want to do is I'm going to send you a link to a former committee that has a final report. And this was the one that I was on that I mentioned, the Energy Futures Task Force for Concord. Let me make sure it's linked there. yeah, full report. So that's the link to the Energy Futures Task Force. They were the group that created that Article 51 or Concord's energy goals. And that report lays out the need for a staff person to be the point person on these kinds of topics. And the article that we brought to town meeting, Article 51, didn't just get approved. It was, we had the biggest night of town meeting. We have an in-person town meeting. So we had, you know, a good 1,000 people there, and a little less than 1,000 people because it was a bad weather night. But there was only 3 no votes, and everyone else was in support of it. And these are the citizens in the town. This is not, and it wasn't a stacked audience either. It was an audience of parents, an audience of others. And really what gave people the confidence was the year's work on coming up with these ideas. They were vetted through the committees. And this vote was to have the citizens say, yes, this is a worthy goal. Yes, you've done your homework. And yes, we're willing to fund it with our tax dollars.
Well, I think we're into an hour and 15 minutes since our start, so I think we should probably wrap up.
I would like to say, Brian, that this was a terrific presentation, and Concord is so lucky to have you.
Yeah, well, it's not really a presentation. It's really just Q&A, and answering the questions that you have, I find generally works better than formalizing everything I know into some long, boring presentation that you've got to keep notes to ask questions at the end. Those are difficult meetings for me. So.
Okay, well, Brian, I want to thank you. You were just fabulous, and we might be asking you more questions further on down the road about electric buses. You know a real lot. And I want to thank everybody for coming. And our next meeting will be in March, and it'll be about electric school buses. It'll be with Brian Cruikshank. He's the transportation director of the Beverly School District, and they've begun the process of electrifying their buses with Highland Electric Transportation. And we haven't set the date yet, so just check your emails. And again, I want to just thank everybody for coming and thank Brian.
Yeah, thank you
so much, Brian.
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Have a good day.
Thank you. Same to you.